Perhaps there is no other area on the globe that has been historically fought over more than the Levant. The Levant refers to the region on the eastern banks of the Mediterranean Sea and somewhat inland. Today, the Levant is populated by the nations of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, but control over the region has changed innumerable times. Any understanding of Middle Eastern history, however, requires a broad understanding of how control over this important region has changed through the centuries. The ancient world witnessed a multitude of peoples populating the Levant and several significant kingdoms laboring to gain exclusive control over the area. The ancient Egyptians, Hittites, Canaanites, and others at times moved into the area at an early date. The Phoenicians were one of the first to create an empire exclusively in the region. The Phoenicians became important commercial traders in the ancient world, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, including southern Europe and northern Africa, the most significant being Carthage on the North African coast. Even as the Phoenicians established their empire first in the Levant and then across the Mediterranean, another important people group emerged in the Levant that would have long-ranging implications for the area. Jews looked to Abraham of the Bible as the father of their people. They believed that God called Abraham and his descendants to be his special people, and, as Abraham's son Isaac was ceremonially sacrificed, so too were the Jews specially dedicated to God's service. A unique feature of the Jews in the ancient world was their monotheism. Whereas other peoples in Egypt and Mesopotamia worshipped a multitude of gods, the Jews only worshipped one God, whom they referred to as Yahweh. Jews adopted the name Israel after the grandson of Abraham, who was named Jacob, but whose name was changed by God to Israel. As Jacob, that is Israel, wrestled with God, so too would the Jews wrestle with God's will for them as a people throughout their history. A key early figure in Jewish history was Moses. Jews view Moses as the first of the great prophets and the deliverer of the people from their enslavement by the Egyptians. Moses was also a key figure, as it is he who received the Jewish law from God on Mount Sinai and then passed it along to the people for their obedience. Another key figure in early Jewish history was their second king, King David. King David was the first to make Israel a formidable kingdom in the Levant and successfully defeated many of Israel's enemies throughout the Levant. For many years, some scholars were skeptical that such a figure or person named David actually was a king of Israel. But in 1993, the Tel Dan Stela was discovered, and it included an inscription that actually mentioned King David. It was the first source outside of the Bible verifying the existence of the Israelite king. King David's kingdom of Israel prospered for a time and continued to do so under his son Solomon. But divisions in the kingdom eventually ripped the kingdom in half during a period of civil war, and the once united kingdom of Israel under King David was now divided into two kingdoms: the kingdom of Israel to the north, comprised of 10 tribes, and the kingdom of Judah to the south, composed of 2 tribes. In their separated, weakened state, the two kingdoms were subject to constant attacks by larger neighboring empires. The northern kingdom of Israel succumbed to the Assyrian kingdom and was taken away into captivity in the 8th century BC. Approximately 150 years later, the southern kingdom of Judah was overrun by the Babylonian Empire, and its citizens were taken into exile in the 580s BC. For 70 years, the Jews lived in Babylon, far from their homeland. But in the 6th century BC, the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, permitted some Jews to return to their homeland and once again worship their God. The prophet Ezra led the returning Jews to rebuild their temple that the Babylonians had destroyed, and Nehemiah oversaw the rebuilding of the destroyed walls of Jerusalem. Once again, the Jews in the Levant were a tiny people group surrounded by much larger and more powerful empires. After Persian domination of the Levant, next came the Greeks under Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, his expensive empire split into 4 portions: each led by one of his generals. It was the family known as the Seleucids that now gained control of the Levant along with its local Jews. A particularly oppressive leader during the Greek occupation was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was king of the Seleucid or Greek Empire from 175 to 164 BC. The Jews of the Levant particularly found Antiochus Epiphanes revolting because he did not demonstrate the same respect for Jewish religion as did Cyrus the Great. In fact, Antiochus went so far as to place a statue of Zeus, a Greek pagan god, in the Jewish temple at the altar, thus desecrating the Jewish temple and house of worship. In response to this outrage against the Jews, a Jewish revolutionary and rebel leader roused the Jews to action and insurrection. Judas Maccabeus was a priest who mobilized the Jews to fight back against the pagan influences the Greeks attempted to impose upon them. The Maccabean revolt was a series of wars that lasted nearly a decade. The revolt initially was not successful, and the Greeks maintained control of the Levant. But as the Greek Empire began to dissolve due to growing Roman power, the Jews managed to secure some nominal independence for their beloved Judea. A key event that occurred during the revolt became a significant Jewish tradition. When the followers of Judas Maccabeus eventually secured control of the temple in Jerusalem, they found only enough oil to maintain the menorah or lampstand for a single day. But according to Jewish tradition, once the Jews relit the menorah with the oil turned out to last for 8 days. Many Jews still today celebrate Hanukkah today in reference to this event. Palestine was not able to hold on to its independence for long. The mighty Roman Empire moved into the area as they did all across the Mediterranean. The Levant was now under the control of the Romans and the Roman Empire. Amidst the dominance of the Roman Empire, the Jews in Palestine lived a unique existence. They lived in a kingdom that came under the authority of the Roman Empire. The kingdom of Judea comprised the regions of Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and Idumea to the south. Thus, even though the Jews were part of the larger Roman Empire, they were also under the authority of a local monarch. The family of rulers who ruled the kingdom of Judea were known as the Herods. Herod I, also known as Herod the Great, born around 72 BC and dying in 4 BC, was a Roman client king who ruled Judea for 33 years, from 37 BC to 4 BC. Appointed by the Roman Senate with the backing of Mark Antony and Octavian, later known as Augustus, he came to power following a period of imperial conflict and internal strife within Judea. Herod's reign is marked both by significant accomplishments and controversial actions. Herod was a renowned builder, known for colossal projects across his kingdom. The lavish rebuilding and expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem was his most famous undertaking, creating a platform that still forms part of the foundation of the Temple Mount today. Thus, Judea was a backwoods region in the Roman Empire, far from the emperor and senate in Rome, and thus open to a degree of independence under the Herods as long as they paid taxes and obeyed imperial Rome. It was into this backwoods kingdom of Judea that Jesus of Nazareth was born somewhere around 4 or 5 BC. Jesus appealed to those looking for a heavenly kingdom beyond the kingdom of the Herods and the lavish power of the Roman Empire. Jesus was born at approximately the same time that Herod the Great died. Herod had been paranoid that a king had been born in Bethlehem that threatened his rule and ordered the murder of thousands of Jewish infants in an effort to kill the newborn king. When Herod the Great died in 4 BC, the kingdom of Judea was divided among his sons. The region of Judea proper was ruled over by a new Herod known as Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was also known as a tetrarch, that is, one of 4 rulers in the kingdom of Judea. Like his father, Herod Antipas was also paranoid that a future king was growing up in his dominions that would one day challenge his power. When many claimed that the future king was the popular teacher and healer Jesus of Nazareth, Herod Antipas wanted to personally meet the teacher. He wanted Jesus to perform a miracle to satisfy his curiosity, but Jesus refused and remained silent in the presence of Herod. Herod dismissed Jesus as certainly no threat to his kingship and had him lashed and sent away. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, the kingdom of Judea continued to simmer with revolt against Roman rule. As the Jews grew increasingly restless under Roman authority, they eventually broke out in full revolt. To suppress the revolt, the Roman general Titus marched into Judea in 70 AD, laid siege to Jerusalem, and then destroyed much of the city that Herod the Great had built. Jews were scattered from the city itself. Jewish temple furnishings were seized by the Romans and carried off. Many Jews were sent into slavery, and many were scattered. One large group of Jewish rebels endeavored to retreat to the mountain fortress of Masada. Masada is a large complex on the top of a natural mountain. The Jews at Masada held out for a while against a Roman siege, but eventually succumbed to the power of the Roman army. Masada was sacked, and the Jews were slaughtered. Masada represented the last major bit of Jewish resistance against Roman authority, and the kingdom of Judea was decimated and no more. After the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Jews from the Levant were dispersed out of their homeland. The diaspora refers to the scattering of the Jews out of the Levant and into Europe and Asia. The diaspora is how European nations such as Germany, France, Spain, Eastern Europe, and Russia acquired its large Jewish communities. The notion of wandering and scattering and longing for a homeland becomes a key part of Jewish identity during these years. With the Jews having no homeland to call their own, but still seeking community, the important institution that became fundamental to Jewish identity was the synagogue. The synagogue was a place of worship for Jews, and a place for Jews to associate with other Jews, preserving their traditions, reading the law, and preserving their ethnic identity. Fundamental to worship at the synagogue was reading from the Talmud. The Talmud was not the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, but it was an extensive commentary on the Mosaic law and added many additional provisions and requirements to the law not contained in the original Old Testament. The two largest groups of Jews that scattered across Europe and Asia were the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews referred to those Jews who migrated to Spain and often came into conflict with Christian and Muslim populations. Ashkenazi Jews refer to those Jews who moved into Asia and formed the large Jewish populations in Russia and in Eastern Europe. During the diaspora of the Jews out of the Levant and into Asia and Europe, a stronger power moved into the region. Across the 7th century AD, Arab Muslims moved north out of the Arabian Peninsula and conquered the entirety of the Middle East, including the Levant. Although Jews and Christians still lived in the Levant in Jerusalem, they were no match for the overpowering strength of the Arabs. Those left in the Levant were required to convert or pay taxes and often suffered worse fates. The Arab conquest of the Levant in the 7th century marked the first large migration of Arabs to the area. For much of subsequent history, the Levant, also called Palestine, would be frequently contested between Christians, Jews, and Arabs. Thus, the 7th century Arab invasions were the beginnings of Arab settlement of the Levant. Arab residents in the area became known as Palestinians, Arab Muslims who live in the Levant, that is Palestine. The homeland in which Jews no longer predominated became the homeland of the Palestinian Arabs, setting up the bitter conflict between these two groups in the 20th century. The movement of the Arab Muslims into Palestine caused great alarm in Christian Europe. Christians throughout Europe could not stomach the idea of followers of Muhammad occupying the city where Jesus ministered and was crucified. After the Pope called on Christian Europe to go on crusade and liberate Palestine, thousands responded to the call. Several crusades would follow in the next several centuries, bearing mixed results and often very little. Christian crusaders did gain access to the holy city of Jerusalem in the 11th century, but the Christian crusaders never really succeeded in taking back the Holy Land from the Arab Muslims. Instead, the Crusades left a legacy of bitterness and hatred between Christians and Muslims, which would endure in following centuries. By the end of the Middle Ages, therefore, three large religious groups made claims towards Palestine, each for their own reasons. The Jews claimed it as their land, as the land given to their father Abraham. Arab Muslims claimed it as their possession, successfully conquered. Christians still longed for access to the Holy Land as the birthplace of their religion, Christianity. The creation of the Ottoman Empire and its extension into the Levant brought stability to the area for several centuries. The Levant was still populated by a mix of Arabs, Jews, and some Christians, but Ottoman troops were not going to tolerate revolt and instability in the area and therefore maintain a semblance of order for centuries in the Levant. The longing for a Jewish homeland was kept alive by many Jews even as they were scattered across Eurasia. But the most conservative of Jews believed that only a coming Messiah could establish a Jewish state, and to do so apart from the Messiah was not the will of God. Hasidic Jews are members of a Jewish religious group characterized by a distinct form of Orthodox Judaism, emphasizing spirituality, emotional expression in prayer, and a close connection with their spiritual leader. Originating in the 18th century as a spiritual revival movement in the Ukraine, Hasidism emphasizes devotion to God through prayer, mystical interpretations of Jewish texts, and a close-knit community life. Hasidic Jews from their inception opposed the secular power grab of those seeking a Jewish homeland and sought to build strong communities in the countries wherein they resided. But more secular Jews in the diaspora would not let the dream of a Jewish state pass away. A principal leader of this effort was Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. Herzl was a Jew living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he remained a tireless advocate through his writings and activism for international support for a modern Jewish state, even as some Jews opposed him. Zionism, of which Herzl was the founder, was the dream of the creation of this Jewish state in Palestine. That stability, however, came to an end with the coming of the First World War to the Middle East. The decaying and old Ottoman Empire proved utterly unable to block the advance of the Western Allies against their empire. By 1917, the British Army had moved through Egypt and into the Levant. Local Ottoman forces could not stop the advance and gradually surrendered more and more territory to the Allied forces. The city of Jerusalem itself was surrounded in 1917 and then finally forced to surrender to the British. The surrender of Jerusalem to Western forces was a major transition point for the region. The international community would now decide how the land in the area was divided, what pieces were given to whom, and how it would be governed. The movement to create a modern Jewish state was given an enormous endorsement when, in 1917, Arthur Balfour, Secretary of the British Foreign Office, issued the Balfour Declaration. The declaration was a clear and official statement by the British government that it supported the creation of a homeland for Jews. The declaration meant more because British troops had in the same year defeated the Ottomans in Palestine and liberated Jerusalem from Muslim control for the first time in over 1,000 years. The declaration confirmed the support of the British government for a Jewish homeland, but it also stated that nothing should cancel the civil and religious rights of the local non-Jewish residents then still living in Palestine, namely the Muslim Palestinians. Future generations of Jews and Arabs would see what they wanted to see in the Balfour Declaration, and the document's ambiguity would lead to generations of conflict to come. After the Balfour Declaration, Jews meeting at the World Zionist Organization in 1919 quickly outlined what they believed should be their ancestral homeland and what they claimed was rightfully theirs. The Jewish territories claimed in Palestine spread roughly across the Levant, with the Mediterranean Sea to the west, the border of Lebanon to the north, the nation of Jordan to the east, and Saudi Arabia and Egypt to the south. The Palestinians living in the land were not given consideration for a state to call their own. Delaying the question of what nations would compose the Middle East, with the Ottoman Empire no more, the League of Nations established a mandate system over the region. The French would govern the region that would eventually become Syria and Jordan. The British would oversee the territory that would become Iraq, and a separate mandate was granted to the British over Palestine that became known as the British Mandate of Palestine. The gathering crisis of World War II, however, delayed further division of the land, and thus Arabs and Jews continued to live in the same land in relative peace. Tragic events occurring outside of the Holy Land would come to impact questions of land ownership significantly in the Levant. Nazi Germany's attempt to destroy the Jews of Europe in what would become known as the Holocaust brought unprecedented levels of attention to the plight of international Jews. 6 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazis during the war. Millions more were displaced and became refugees and sought a place to settle. The unprecedented plight of European Jews after the Holocaust garnered them increased sympathy from the international community and support for the creation of a permanent Jewish state. In 1947, in an attempt to satisfy the desire for land by both the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs in the area, the recently created United Nations divided much of the Levant between the two groups. The Jews would receive much of the coast and the south. The Arabs would receive 3 pieces, including part of the north, the western bank of the Jordan River, as well as the strip of land along the coast that included the city of Gaza. The division was a compromise which the Israelis quickly accepted and declared their independence, but much of the Arab world quickly rejected. Zionism, the migration of international Jews to Palestine, which occurred in steady numbers before World War II, continued to increase dramatically after the war. Many Jews believed they would never be safe in Europe again, and many also believed they would never be safe outside their own permanent homeland. Yet the dislocations of war also sparked the migration of many Muslims to Palestine as well. Despite whatever sufferings the Jews of Europe had experienced during the war, the local Arab Palestinians were not interested in surrendering their long-held lands to the influx of Jews. Jews continued to stealthily move into Palestine, however. They set up independent and self-sufficient agricultural communities known as a kibbutz. A kibbutz was a socialist community where members lived, worked, and shared resources together. The kibbutz settlement as a socialist community emphasized from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Members typically resided in communal housing without private property and shared meals and facilities. The kibbutz system also formed the beginnings of a homeland protective force, the makings of what would become the Israeli Army, or IDF, Israeli Defense Force. Men and women were trained and prepared for combat. Believing the time had come and no more waiting was necessary, Jews in Palestine declared the formation of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. They announced a Declaration of Independence that declared the State of Israel, the right of Israelis to defend themselves, and all the privileges that modern states were entitled to. David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister of the new Israeli state. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 represented a fulfilled dream for generations and generations of Jews. Ever since the beginning of the diaspora, Jews always longed to return to what they deemed the Holy Land that God Himself had given to their father Abraham. Critical to the success of the State of Israel in 1948 and for its future was the recognition and support by the world's largest economy and superpower. 11 minutes after the proclamation of the independence of Israel, the United States government, through President Harry Truman, announced recognition and support. The endorsement was immense for the aspiring nation. The United States recognition that was granted immediately upon Israel's creation would continue for decades to come, with particularly American Jews encouraging the continuation of that support. Arab allies of the United States, however, were appalled at the U.S. support for Israel, and the U.S. would find new adversaries in the Middle East due to its unflappable support for Israel, whether it be economic or military support. The consequences of the creation of the Jewish state were a disaster for the local Palestinians. Palestinians would always refer to their banishment from their homes by Jews as the Nakba, that is, the catastrophe. Instantly, they found themselves to be strangers in their own land. Jewish guards ordered them from their homes and immediately kicked them out of claimed Jewish possessions. Violence was commonplace, and murder not uncommon. All across Palestine, there were scenes of dispossessed women and children on roads, fleeing their homes, seeking a new destination. The legacy of the Nakba and the creation of the State of Israel would lead to decades of bitterness and violence between Jews and Arabs in the region, with both groups claiming Palestine was their homeland and the homeland of their fathers. The displaced Palestinians incurred the support of neighboring Arab nations, and war broke out between the Arabs and Jews in 1948 upon the creation of the State of Israel. The war began with attacks by Palestinian Arab irregulars and, following the declaration of Israeli independence, the invasion of Arab armies from neighboring states. The newly formed Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, initially faced pressure but eventually gained the offensive, pushing back the Arab forces and capturing territory. A new set of borders were created for Israel by the end of the war, borders that included pockets of remaining Palestinians such as the Gaza Strip on the Mediterranean Sea and the West Bank, a strip of land along the Jordan River. Nevertheless, the Israelis won the war and secured their independence and the creation of the fragile state. Israelis would always view their history as a struggle for survival, and the danger of their encirclement and destruction was always a real threat. The Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was the first of three major wars the Israelis would have to fight to secure their state and prevent defeat at the hands of the neighboring Arab countries. A pivotal figure in the history of the early Israeli state was David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion had been a longtime Zionist supporter and a very early advocate for an independent Israeli state. In fact, he helped to write Israel's Declaration of Independence, organized Jewish militias into the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, and was Israel's first prime minister. He is known as Israel's founding father and did a lot to launch the new country. The democracy that Israel created was a parliamentary democracy. Citizens were granted the right to vote for a parliament, known in Israel as the Knesset. The political party that won the most votes would also be able to rule from the prime minister's office. With the proclamation of a Jewish state in Palestine, an interesting confluence of three major world religions has since existed in Jerusalem since 1948. In what would become one of the most contested areas of the world, Jerusalem would feature the significant Muslim mosque known as the Dome of the Rock, the remnants of Herod's temple that existed during the time of Jesus, and the Wailing Wall, which became an important site of Jewish mourning. This site in Jerusalem would become a tense symbol of the different religions and peoples that all claimed historic rights to the city of Jerusalem and the larger area of Palestine. One of the early flashpoints of crisis in Palestine that signaled the area was far from settled was the 1956 Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis of 1956 began when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized or took over the Suez Canal. This act prompted a secret invasion by Israel, Britain, and France of the area. The invasion was a military success for the Allied forces, but a major diplomatic and political failure. Under immense pressure from U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower as well as the Soviet Union, the invading countries were forced to withdraw, leading to a significant shift in global power dynamics. The fledgling Israeli state created in 1948 was significantly strengthened by the creation of Mossad. Mossad is Israel's national intelligence agency, responsible for gathering foreign intelligence, conducting covert operations, and counterterrorism outside of Israel's borders. Established in 1949, the agency reports directly to the Prime Minister and operates under a mandate of secrecy to protect Israel's national security. Mossad is known for its high-profile operations, including the capture of former Nazi Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and the targeted assassinations of individuals linked to attacks against Israel. The second of the three major wars Israel fought to maintain their independence from their Arab neighbors was the so-called Six-Day War of 1967. The Six-Day War was a brief but decisive conflict in June of 1967 in which Israel fought and defeated a coalition of neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The war lasted from June 5th to June 10th and resulted in Israel capturing significantly more territory, tripling the land it previously controlled. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. The subsequent status of these territories has been a central issue in the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. The defeat of the Arab armies, who had previously claimed to champion the Palestinian cause, spurred the rise of a more independent Palestinian national movement. The conflict created hundreds of thousands of new Palestinian refugees, adding to the existing crisis. Israel's growing strength was augmented by the effective leadership of its only female prime minister, indeed one of the strongest female leaders in world history. Golda Meir was an Israeli politician who served as the fourth prime minister of Israel from 1969 to 1974. Known as the Iron Lady of Israeli politics, Meir was a founding member of the state and became one of the world's first female heads of government. Her political career spanned several decades and placed her at the center of Israel's most formative years, though her legacy remains complex and debated. Golda Mamavovich was born in 1898 in Kiev, in what was then the Russian Empire. Her family endured poverty and the threat of anti-Semitic violence, which she later cited as a defining motivation for her commitment to Jewish security. Her family immigrated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1906, where she grew up and received her education. As a teenager, she became an ardent labor Zionist, a movement advocating for a Jewish homeland based on socialist principles. In 1921, she and her husband immigrated to British-controlled Palestine and joined a kibbutz, or collective settlement. There, her strong leadership abilities were recognized, launching her political career. Golda Meir developed a stronger relationship with the United States and successive presidents. Her commitment to the security and prosperity of the Israeli state was paramount and always her primary focus. The third major war that Israel fought to maintain its independence was the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The Yom Kippur War began as a surprise attack launched by a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria against Israel on October 6, 1973, which coincided with the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. The war lasted for 3 weeks. Israel was taken completely by surprise when Syria invaded the Golan Heights and Egypt seized and crossed the Suez Canal and moved into the Sinai Peninsula. Both Syria and Egypt were endeavoring to take back land that had been lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. The Egyptian military carried out an impressive operation building pontoon bridges across the Suez Canal, and then quickly moving tanks and troops across the waterway. Israel's defense forces were led by the charismatic and inspiring General Moshe Dayan. Dayan is remembered for his trademark eye patch and his ability to rally Israeli forces and defend the state even at its most desperate moments. Many initially blamed Dayan for Israel's failure to anticipate the attack in 1973, but his subsequent efforts in managing Israel's defense, winning the war, and his role in contracting peace with Egypt restored his reputation as a national hero. The tide of war began to turn not on land but on the Mediterranean Sea. A flotilla of Israeli missile boats successfully destroyed Egyptian naval forces off the coast in October. More significantly, the Israelis formed their own crossing points across the Suez Canal and now invaded Egypt at points they were not expecting. When the war concluded, Israeli forces had seized back the Golan Heights and additional Syrian land, as well as holding on to Egyptian territory itself. Whereas peace seemed very far away with the outbreak of the war, suddenly both sides wanted to see an end to the war and a reduction in violence. Quite unexpectedly, a major peace treaty was agreed upon just a few years later after the Yom Kippur War. At the U.S. Presidential Retreat Center known as Camp David, U.S. President Jimmy Carter brokered a peace agreement between the Egyptians and Israelis that became known as the Camp David Accords. The Accords led to the signing of the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in 1979, ending 30 years of war between the two nations. The agreements included terms for Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, the establishment of Palestinian autonomy, and the invitation for other Arab states to join the peace process. Egypt was the first Arab nation to ever recognize Israel as a state, and remarkably, the peace agreement has lasted for several decades. The Camp David Accords were followed up by the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. The Oslo Accords were a pair of interim peace agreements signed in 1993 and 1995 between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Signed during a period of secret negotiations in Norway, the Accords established a framework for Palestinian self-rule and mutual recognition, aiming for a final peace treaty based on UN resolutions. Key provisions included the formation of the Palestinian Authority, which gained governing responsibilities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and the eventual goal of a two-state solution. The third major peace agreement involving Israel in recent years were the so-called Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are a series of agreements that normalize diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab nations, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, beginning in 2020. Brokered with the involvement of the United States, these accords marked a significant shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics, moving away from decades of hostility towards cooperation in areas like trade, security, and technology, despite the underlying Israeli-Palestinian conflict that endures. Modern Israel has been led by one of its most powerful and controversial prime ministers. Benjamin Netanyahu was first elected as prime minister in 1996. A true political survivor, Netanyahu has come in and out of power, serving 3 consequential spells as Prime Minister of Israel. Sometimes called King Bibi, his control of the government, his influence over U.S. presidents, and his determined defense of Israel has made him consequential, but also the subject of much criticism. Netanyahu has led Israel into wars with Lebanon, Syria, Iran's proxies such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and even Iran itself. The Palestinians have particularly had a tortured relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. Local Arabs have often felt the brunt of Netanyahu's aggressive policies and willingness to deploy the full fist of the Israeli Defense Forces to expand Israel. Palestinians have often felt alone and undefended by the rest of the world. Increasingly, Palestinians have been confined in the large West Bank territory as well as the Gaza Strip. These are 2 very densely populated areas, with Palestinians often living in unsanitary conditions without access to adequate food and medical care. High rates of unemployment predominate in Palestinian areas. In an effort to improve the condition of the Palestinians and advocate for them, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded in 1964. The organization represents Palestinians around the world and seeks international support for their cause against Israel. The long-standing chairman of the PLO was Yasser Arafat. Arafat was a Palestinian who grew up in Egypt and opposed the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. He fought against Israel in the 1948 war and spent the rest of his life advocating for the causes of Palestinians. Arafat was also a controversial figure throughout his lifetime. Many Palestinians viewed him as a martyr for his people's cause. Israelis viewed him as a terrorist. Some Palestinians viewed him as too willing to seek peace and give in to Israel in land concessions. The official governing organization of the Palestinians today in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was created by the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and has endeavored to provide some leadership for the Palestinians under the supervising umbrella of the Israelis. Today, the Palestinian Authority exerts partial civil control in 167 land pockets in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Although it has limited power and is often perceived as weak and corrupt, it does provide Palestinians with some unity and political advocacy. The Palestinian Authority also governed the Gaza Strip until a militant militia known as Hamas took power in 2007. Hamas is an Islamic resistance movement supported by Iran that seeks to destroy Israel and spread Islamic rule over the Levant. Their most common weapon against Israel has been acts of terrorism. Hamas is based in the Gaza Strip, and particularly Gaza City. As one of the most densely populated areas in the world, Hamas can blend in with the local Palestinians and form a large terrorist organization among people with similar grievances. In order to hide their clandestine activities, Hamas has also constructed an elaborate series of tunnels beneath Gaza City where they can stockpile weapons, ammunition, and explosives to plan additional terrorist attacks against Israel. The long-standing antagonism between Hamas and Israel exploded into its largest and most violent conflict in October of 2023. Hamas operatives crossed into Israel from the Gaza Strip quite unexpectedly and achieved extraordinary surprise to attack the Jews. The attacks began early on 7th of October with a barrage of at least 4,300 rockets launched into Israel and vehicle-transported and powered paraglider incursions into Israel. Hamas fighters breached the Gaza-Israel barrier, attacking military bases and massacring civilians in 21 different Israeli communities. A large group of Israelis who were caught by surprise were attending a popular music festival when the Hamas invasion occurred. Hamas agents massacred Israeli civilians, raped women, and took many hostage. Hostages were seized by Hamas agents and rushed back across the border into the Gaza Strip and into the tunnels beneath Gaza City. Many Israelis were frustrated with the Netanyahu's government's inability to anticipate the Hamas attack and even more frustrated at the Israeli government's inability to secure the release of the hostages. The October attacks in 2023 by Hamas against Israel led to the deaths of 1,139 people. 695 of the victims were Israeli civilians, including 38 children. Another 71 foreign nationals were killed, as well as 373 members of the Israeli security forces. 251 civilians and soldiers were taken captive into Gaza by Hamas. The response of the Netanyahu government was immediate and fierce. The prime minister announced Israel was now at war with Hamas and quickly launched a full-scale military invasion of the Gaza Strip and Gaza City itself. Israeli reservists were called up for military action, and air and ground units were deployed in full force against the Palestinians of Gaza. Numerous neighborhoods of Gaza City were bombed repeatedly by the Israeli Air Force. Israeli armored units were sent into the Strip to clean out pockets of Hamas fighters and to take no prisoners. Infantry forcibly moved entire neighborhoods of Palestinians out of their homes and towards designated zones. Entire neighborhoods were leveled by explosives. The destruction of the Gaza Strip was massive. Close to 3/4 of all buildings were bombed, damaged, or completely destroyed, and made unlivable. The Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip was so extensive that some in the international community and even some Israelis themselves criticized the Israeli Defense Forces' actions and accused the Israeli government of ethnic cleansing and war crimes. Much of the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip was pushed closer to the sea as a buffer zone was created by the Israeli Defense Forces between Israel and the population of the Gaza Strip. Israel's war against Hamas set off a major humanitarian crisis. With disrupted food supplies to the Gaza Strip, the local Palestinian population collapsed into famine conditions and massive medical shortages. Israel's campaign against the Gaza Strip and the poor conditions it engendered led to tens of thousands of Palestinian casualties, with no hope of resolution, peace, or prosperity in sight for the future. Thus, the tortured history between Arabs and Jews in the area known as Levant, which has often erupted into terrible violence, only seems to be growing more despair, and only violence seems to be on the horizon in the future.